Introduction to A Short History of the Arab Peoples by Sir John Glubb. When I began to write this book, two problems immediately presented themselves. The first of these was its title. Should it be called The History of the Arabs? And, if so, who are the Arabs? The name was originally used to designate the nomadic tribes of Arabia, and indeed is still used in that sense as a secondary meaning. The collective name in Arabic for a group of tents is an Arab. In the 7th century, however, these nomads established a great empire extending from the Atlantic to the borders of China, north of Tibet. For 3 or 4 centuries, the Muslim inhabitants of this empire were known as Arabs. With the disintegration of the Arab Empire in the 10th century, the word reverted to its meaning of nomads, the peoples of the empire resuming their previous designations of Egyptians, Syrians, Persians, or whatever it might be. In the same manner, in the heyday of the Roman Empire, an Egyptian, a Syrian, or a Spaniard might be a Roman, but with the disintegration of the Roman Empire, the name was abandoned by the provincials. This situation continued until the First World War, except for a partial attempt to impose the name of Ottomans on the subjects of that empire. After the First World War, Syrians and Iraqis began once again to call themselves Arabs, at least in an international sense. Only since the Second World War have Egypt and North Africa been included in the list of Arab countries. Since the 1930s, a number of studies of the inhabitants of Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq have been made. By recording such physical characteristics as head shape, height, sitting height, skin, hair, eyes, features, and so on, the extraordinary diversity of races in these countries has been revealed. Footnote. I use the word race as it is defined in the Oxford Dictionary as, quote, a group of persons connected by common descent, or, quote, regarded as of common stock. In other words, as an ethnic and not a cultural group. End of footnote. For the earliest times, archaeology has come to our aid. We know now that many of the peoples of Syria and Iraq 4,000 or 5,000 years ago were not racially related to the Arabs. The Sumerians, 3000 BC, came from the east and settled in Iraq and northern Syria. The Hurrians came from the direction of North Persia, the Hittites from Asia Minor. These races seem to have been Aryans. In historical times, the same processes have continued. For 1,000 years, for example, Syria and Palestine were closely connected with and colonized by Greeks and Romans. The early Arab historians were aware of these racial diversities. They referred quite correctly to the tribes of Arabia as Arabs and to the subjects of their empire as Arabicized. Some modern writers have preferred to call the people of the Arabian Peninsula Arabians, and the Syrians, Iraqis, Egyptians, and North Africans Arabs. An alternative is to call the inhabitants of the peninsula Arabs, and the remainder Arabic-speaking peoples. Such devices would be extremely cumbrous in the title of this book. I accordingly decided to use the expression Arab peoples, the plural being intended to indicate that many different ethnic groups are involved, though all share the Arabic language and culture. I venture to suggest to the reader that the vicissitudes of these people in history will be more easily understood if he remembers that they consist of many diverse races sharing the same language. But to explain that the Arabic-speaking peoples all differ from one another is merely academic unless some attempt be made to analyze the characteristics of each. Such an analysis must necessarily be broad, yet, in fact, the differences are in many respects extremely striking. The Central Arabians. The majority of these people are now subjects of Saudi Arabia, but in the north they extend into the desert between Syria and the Euphrates. These northern tribes, many of them still partially or wholly nomadic, are homogeneous with the peoples of Saudi Arabia. These Arabians, the original Arabs, are an old and almost unmixed race. This means that their characteristics are extremely uniform. Physically, and probably mentally and spiritually also, they resemble one another with few deviations. The deserts of Arabia have never attracted foreign invaders. The holy cities of Mecca and Medina, on the contrary, have long been inhabited by mixed populations from all Muslim countries. And, since 1945, there has been a large influx of other Arabic-speaking races into the oil fields, and more recently, into the capital, Riyadh. There are now, therefore, several centers of mixed population, but Saudi Arabia as a whole is still principally inhabited by the ancient Arab race. These Arabs bear certain resemblances to the peoples of Northwest Europe. They are of a practical, realist turn of mind, ready to strike a bargain or to compromise, hardy, enterprising, and courageous. They differ from Northwest Europeans in their self-reliance and readiness to take the initiative, perhaps the result of thousands of years of existence in a poor country of great open spaces. This individualism often leads to jealous rivalries, to an extreme sensitivity on what they consider to be personal honor, and to a certain lack of communal loyalty and public spirit. This old Arab race were the conquerors of the empire in the 7th century, and they are still excellent military material, though their ignorance of technology makes them, at the moment, incapable of meeting modern armies. Perhaps the simplest proof of the paucity of Arabian blood in the other Arabic-speaking peoples is provided by the sparse population of the desert peninsula. The number of inhabitants in the whole vast peninsula of Arabia today is less than half that of the tiny Nile Delta. When the Arabians broke out of their deserts and conquered their immense empire, they did so with armies of 15 or 20,000 men. It has been estimated that, when all the conquests were over, the Arabians represented only 1% of the population of their empire. The remainder were a medley of many different races. Even today, Arabian blood may well constitute only 1 or 2% of that of the people of some of the Arab countries. The Syrians, including the Lebanese and the Arabs of Palestine. Syria forms a complete contrast to Saudi Arabia. Whereas no foreign invaders were tempted by Arabia, the history of Syria is little more than a list of foreign invasions. The climate of Syria was tempting to races from colder northern countries. Moreover, the long narrow strip of country from Aleppo to Gaza, confined by the Mediterranean on one side and the desert on the other, constituted an isthmus joining Asia and Eastern Europe to Africa. From the dawn of history, an endless succession of invading armies and migrating nations traveled up and down this Syrian causeway. In 539 BC, Syria was conquered by the Persians. In 333 BC, by Alexander the Great. Thereafter, until the Arab conquest in AD 636, Syria remained Greek or Roman for 1,000 years, a period during which extensive immigration took place from Greece, Italy, and other Mediterranean countries. The Syrians are racially unrelated to the Arabs of Arabia. Many of their characteristics resemble those of the Greeks, particularly their extreme intellectual subtlety. As professors, philosophers, and lawyers, they supplied a considerable number of the intellectual leaders of Rome. Like many intellectuals, they are unpractical in ordinary life and are incapable of compromise. Intellectually, a proposition is correct or erroneous. More practical minds accept the statement that half a loaf is better than no bread, but not so the intellectual. Syrians who migrate achieve honors and distinctions in every country, but at home their subtlety often lacks realism. They are socially charming, extremely courteous, and the heirs of thousands of years of culture. The Syrians are thus not only racially unrelated to the Arabians, but in many ways they're opposites. The Arabians are distinguished by practicality and common sense, the Syrians by subtlety and intellectual theories. The Iraqis seem to be composed of many racial strains. The peoples of southern Iraq are probably largely of Persian or other Eastern origin. Those of northern Iraq are a mixture of Kurds, Turks, early Indo-European races, and Arabs. The Iraqis are less intellectual and less polished and courteous than the Syrians, but are of a stronger and coarser strain. On the other hand, they differ profoundly from the Arabians. The Egyptians are probably the descendants of the people of the pharaohs. It is to be noted, however, that the Sahara forms an almost impassable obstacle between tropical Africa and Mediterranean North Africa. The Nile Valley is almost the only connection between Central Africa and the Mediterranean. As a result, there is no doubt that from prehistoric times, there has been a continual infiltration of Central African blood down the Nile into Egypt. Closely packed in the damp heat of the Nile Delta, the conditions of the lives of Egyptians for thousands of years have been the exact opposite to conditions in Arabia, where the great open spaces have produced individuality and initiative. The density of population and the enervating climate of the Nile Delta have been destructive of initiative and self-reliance. Egyptians are, in general, submissive to authority. They can fight stubbornly in a static and defensive position, but rarely display enough enterprise for moving warfare. Thus, once again, we find the characteristics of the Egyptian, like those of the Syrians, to be the exact opposite of those of the Arabians. The South Arabians may be yet another different race, but I have not seen any scientific analysis of their origin. Very old local tradition divided the Arabs into a northern and a Yemenite race. The sand desert, known as the Empty Quarter, separates Central Arabia from Aden and Hadramaut. The North Africans are quite distinct from the peoples east of Suez. The majority belong to the racial group known as Berbers, who, since prehistoric times, have been located in the area. They are entirely different from Arabs, and the two races do not integrate easily. There are also pockets of Arabs here and there, the remains of tribal immigrations many centuries ago. While the peoples of the Atlas are mainly Berbers, the inhabitants of the coastal plains are of mixed Mediterranean race. Phoenicians, Greeks, Vandals, Italians, Byzantines, Spaniards, and French have all contributed to the coastal population, where they have mingled with Berbers and Arabs. These brief notes will have sufficed to show that the word Arab, as used today, has no racial significance. The Arabs are a linguistic group composed of many races, which often show characteristics not only different, but diametrically opposed to one another. The nearest parallel to the Arab group of peoples is probably to be found in South America, where many different races share the Spanish and the Portuguese languages. In both cases, the common religion and language are due to military conquest several centuries ago and have little or no ethnic significance. If the reader keeps these facts in mind, the historical vicissitudes described in this book will be much more easily understood. The second problem which faced me was where to end my story. This book is intended to be a historical work, and I was tempted to end it in 1900 or with the First World War. It seemed to me, however, that it might be annoying for the reader if I stopped 50 or 60 years ago without connecting the narrative with the situation today. On the other hand, the last 50 years have been so packed with problems, many of them still burning political issues, that to treat them fully would occupy the whole book, leaving no space for the previous 13 centuries of history. I have accordingly carried my story up to the 1950s, but have limited myself to a brief summary of events in the last 50 years. To those who wish to study the political problems of today, a vast selection of works is available, a few of which have been included in the bibliography. Thank you for listening. If you enjoy my work, please consider leaving me a donation through my Buy Me a Coffee page, the link to which you can find in the description of my YouTube channel. Thank you.